most of us here, we know what the fifth direction is all about, a global mythopoetic community based in Australia, but with members from all over the world. And it's good to see a lot of familiar faces here tonight and a lot of new ones as well. So welcome. And tonight I have the great pleasure of introducing Kristina Dryža. And Kristina and I were connected by Melanie Greblo, who's obviously a good friend of ours from the coterie. She may or may not be joining us a little later. And Kristina and I have had a couple of really great chats. And we figured we wanted to kind of bring you a conversation tonight. But first, let me introduce very briefly Kristina. So Kristina is of Lithuanian descent, but she grew up in Adelaide. She lived all over the world, really, traveling and looking at emerging social, cultural, and consumer trends. And, you know, I have to say, Kristina is recognized around the world as one of the world's top futurists. Although when I spoke to Kristina, you sort of was starting to move away from that idea of you as a futurist and more into other areas of your work. She's an archetypal consultant, an author. And Kristina's work really focuses on archetypal and mythic patterns and the patterning of nature's rhythms and nature's influence on creativity, innovation, and leadership. And Kristina is actually coming to us from Nida in Lithuania right now, which is a beautiful, beautiful town situated between the Curonian Lagoon and the Baltic Sea. And I think you ended up there, Kristina, if I'm not mistaken, because you couldn't get back to Australia from the pandemic. But we'll hear a little more about that.
Yeah, with the border laws, I wasn't able to come back home.
Wow. So that's us. The question that we kind of posed tonight, Kristina, wasn't it? It was around that fundamental Jungian question of what myth are you living? And I wanted to kind of begin by kind of defining myth. And, you know, for most of us here that work in this mythological space, we've sort of used to the word myth, but for some of us, we may still think that it means a lie or something untrue. And we're hearing it used that way in contemporary society quite a bit. And so Kristina and I were briefly chatting about that earlier before everybody came on. And I was reminded of something that Robert A. Johnson said. And I remember that he was speaking to a classroom full of children and he asked that question, what does myth mean? And one of the kids gave the answer, a myth is something that's true on the inside, but not on the outside. And Robert says that in all his professional life and career, he hadn't heard a better definition than that. But I sort of wanted to open things up, Kristina, and kind of ask you, you know, how would you define myth?
Yeah, I mean, for those that have, you know, a very strong left brain, and good morning, everybody from Nida on the Baltic Sea coast. A strong left brain, you'd probably like Joseph Campbell's 4 definitions or the 4 functions of myth. I'm not so inclined. So the left brain people, you can put that in the 4 functions of myth into Google and find out what they are. But for me, it's I guess a definition that rings more truer is a myth is what never was, but always is. And I think for me, mythology is really the storehouse, not of ancient wisdom, but the wisdom of what it means to be a human being. Yeah. So I think that kid got it right.
That's beautiful. And I think it reminds me, because you have a role with the Joseph Campbell Foundation, and that's kind of, there's material there and a lot of resources that we often turn to in our community. But I wondered, just briefly before we get into it, what's your role with the Joseph Campbell Foundation these days?
Yeah, I sit on the Editorial Advisory Group. And so people may not know that there's also a group called literati.com, which is a book subscription service. And Joseph Campbell has a Myth and Meaning book club on there. So I host that occasionally out of America. And then every month, but January this year and December, I wrote for the Myth Blast. And what that is really being able to take Campbell's work and not write a book review or, you know, an opinion piece on something, but what is fresh and kind of current in Campbell's work that we kind of see today. So it could be something in regards to taking the Parseval myth and applying it to something that we see like the increase in depression or opioid use, or the Persephone and Demeter myth in the role of the current environmental crisis that we kind of face. So it's really that sense that Campbell's work, Campbell will always be Campbell. But then there's also this knowledge of one person, wisdom of another to a new higher collective form. And I think that actually what myths require of us now is as a reimagining and a remixing. And I think like as we have now post-pandemic, a mix of physical events and digital events, it's also the same with myths. It's a hybrid. And I remember when one of my colleagues actually wrote a piece for the foundation that Billie Eilish is an Aphrodite. And people were like, no, she's an Artemis. And it was like, well, no, you can be a little bit of both. And I think it's that we see that now. Some people might not agree with it, and that pick and mix spirituality, a bit of Kabbalah here, a bit of, you know, Sufism here, a bit of ayahuasca kind of here, you know, and I think it's that same now where it's like it's, for those of you that were familiar with Hades Town, the popular musical that was based on Orpheus and Eurydice and Persephone and Hades, and it sold out, and everyone's just like, why did we go? We know what the ending is. It's like Orpheus, like, you doofus, don't look back. She's there, don't look back. But every night we go to the theater, it's because this will be the one time he doesn't look back. And that is the beauty about myths, that and how we can work with them in our own lives is, what if Orpheus didn't look back? What if Persephone willingly ate the pomegranate seeds? You know, all these things. And then I think then that mythic imagination really becomes alive in us.
So is that connected to, I know you did a pretty popular TEDx talk around why archetypes in mythology kind of matters even more today for us. And is that kind of connected to that thinking, or?
Well, I think that, and maybe if we even put a little of a definition around archetypes, which is, you know, for me, they're patterns on a very simple level, and then we can say that they're patterns of power that the collective unconscious connects to. But if we just kind of really think simply like the kind of patterns, I think so often we try to change the pattern in the physical instead of look at the invisible from where it kind of came from. And I think that actually it's in the invisible realm that actually most of the changes are required to be made. So very, very simply, whether it's that victim archetype is dominating you, you know, to be able to walk in one day in the room as a mystic, everything would change, because within an archetype, there is a mythology, there is a dress, there is a vocabulary, there's gestures. And so often the change that's required is actually that can't be seen by the five senses. And so for me, intuition is really the first sense. It's not really the sixth sense, but it's really being able to say that it's what can't be seen by the eyes is where all the power is. And that's why a lot of my work is, well, how do we bring back in an archetypal consciousness, a poetic imagination, you know, a symbolic lens, the capacity to live mythically, which often, you know, now with a focus on science, technology, and engineering, maths, that kind of gets left behind. But actually, to me, it's the very engine of creation.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we're talking a little bit here about our mythic identity. What is our mythic identity? Which I guess leads us sort of quite nicely into the question that we posed about what myth are you living? Because for me, and I'd be interested in your take, I feel like we've kind of fallen out of story, both individually and culturally. It's like we're not really sure what story we're in. And I think particularly if you look at it culturally in Australia, it's even more pertinent, because, you know, what does it mean to be an Australian? Like, what's the story? And I feel like we've kind of pulled at a lot of different threads over certainly in my generation and maybe the previous one. You know, we've talked about the Anzac story, or all different things that we're trying to kind of pull together to know what's the Australian story. And sometimes, we end up clutching at straws and talking about things like, football and things like that as this way of kind of collectively drawing us together. So I feel like there's this sense that culturally, around the world, we've sort of fallen out of that mythic ground, that mythic territory, fallen out of story, which is why I think that question that we pose tonight is so important.
Yeah, and I think almost there's the part of recognizing the way we interpret the world is story. Like, try to go 5 minutes without telling a story, you can't. We're storying creatures. It's how we make meaning and sense making, and like human and more, Thomas More would say, soul making. But first, I think there's a step that happens before that, which is we first actually have to be aware of what is the narrative that I'm telling to myself about myself. I'm a loser, or I'm this, or whatever it actually is, before we can then actually co-create a new narrative of what it means to be an Australian or a human being and what's looking to be a galactic age. And I think what we're, obviously many of us are not aware of what that self-narrative is. And then within that, then it's almost like, how can we engage a collective narrative when I'm not even aware of the storying function of my own psyche? And again, like Carl Jung would say, like, meaning makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything. So when something happens to us, is it the beginning or the end? Is it the dream or a nightmare? Is it the worst thing? Is it the best thing, right? So we're always creating that story. And I think with social media, we what do we omit as much as the story, as the highlight, the Facebook kind of highlight reel that we kind of show. But within that, I think now there's, the greater, I guess, awareness or increase, say, in consciousness, where people are saying, well, what is my purpose? Like, for what reason was I born? And traditionally, I think you would have to be in a monastery for 5 to 10 years before you could even approach, a senior monk or the abbot about that kind of question. While it's something that is, for many, something that is a living question within them. And also more people knowing, but it isn't a vocation. Because so often it's like, what's your story so you can sell it better to make more money or to be able to improve your business, instead of, there's actually a greater narrative weaving within the collective. And maybe it's a good idea to read the quote then.
Yeah, well, I was thinking that. But again, I think what we're coming back to here is the roles and responsibilities that I have in life versus my deep soul identity or my mythopoetic identity, which is what we're talking about here. But yeah, I mean, it's clear that Jung saw that as the fundamental thing to ascertain. And yeah, I have the quote here, so we can put it into a bit of context. It comes from Carl Jung's Collected Works 5. And he says, "I was driven to ask myself in all seriousness, what is the myth you are living? I found no answer to this question and had to admit that I was not living with a myth or even in a myth, but rather in an uncertain cloud of theoretical possibilities which I was beginning to regard with increasing distrust. I did not know that I was living a myth, and even if I had known it, I would not have known what sort of myth was ordering my life without my knowledge. So in the most natural way, I took it upon myself to get to know my myth. And I regarded this as the task of all tasks. I simply had to know what unconscious or preconscious myth was forming me and from what rhizome I sprang." So for him, it was the fundamental process that he was undertaking, I guess.
Yeah, and I think like Joseph, the Joseph Campbell Foundation, often at Esalen, that they haven't recently with COVID and some environmental issues there, runs a yearly workshop. And that was where I was first kind of introduced to this work. Maybe it was like 7 or 8 years ago. And it all sounds like, I think that we're now in this age of, Amazon Prime speed delivery. So we think that we have some awareness or an insight, and then all of a sudden it's like conscious choice and it's become that thing. Or it's like, we think we go to bed a flawed human being and we wake up in the morning a divine spark. It's like we often have to carry awareness for a long time with certain issues before we can move it into conscious choice. Some things only a couple of months, sometimes it's years. And I think when I first was exposed to those ideas, it meant something, but I didn't have the maturity or the awareness to do something with it. And then from then slowly did, but it really hit home last year when studying at for those that, Pacifica Graduate Institute in California, which is all about mythology. And the lecturer in the first class asked everybody, what's been a predominant myth in your life? And that this is people from all different ages, genders, backgrounds, cultures, everything like that. 1/3 of us said the ugly duckling. And I just thought, wow, how all of us with all these different world perspectives, that this one myth has been so central in our lives. And that sense of maybe you were a young teenager and you were overweight, and then maybe you lost the weight as an adult, but you still see yourself as that person, not equating it to ugly, but that you couldn't find yourself. Or it's like the sense that you meet really brilliant people that were at school ostracized, or didn't quite fit into the system, or were on the kind of the spectrum, and now they're feted and heralded for their work, but they still have the perception I'm the ugly duckling. And so that inability to fit in and to find our place is, I think, what leads a lot of people to mythology. And even myself the other day, I kind of knew I had a little bit of that Cinderella myth. And I think, like I said earlier, it's not that we're one myth. I think there's many myths that we're exposed to. And Taylor Swift, I'm not ashamed that I love Taylor Swift. One of her new songs came out called Bejeweled. And there she was as the scullery maid scrubbing the floor. And then that evening I was at a party and someone knocked a drink over. And there I found myself like the scullery maid scrubbing the floor. And I almost had to go into the movement more. And then one of my friends said, Kristina, stop, what are you doing? Like, you're not even the one that knocked the drink over. And it was just to say, like, oh, what is it about that myth that is in me? Is it the growing up with Lithuanian parents in Australia and feeling like a second-class citizen, or what is, or in that invisibility, or never being recognized, or I wasn't part of the cool clique at school, so I never got invited to the ball. What element of it? And even the Australian newspapers have written a lot about how many women fell for the Cinderella myth, where they were expecting a partner, a husband that never came along, and now they don't have any superannuation and any money to retire. So there's, or you might have a friend that always runs into the ugly sisters in the form of bitchy colleagues in no matter what work environment you go to. So there's elements that are there, or it's, you're really struggling sorting out, you're like the inability to remove the non-essential so the essential may speak. And you're like, I'm in the myth of Cupid and Psyche, I'm in Psyche's first task. I can't discriminate any of these seeds. And so I think part of it, again, is being able to say, what element of is it an archetype or the myth, but where's the alchemy that's required, and why has this myth been brought to my attention? And I think there's also, a myth is often trying to find us as much as we're trying to find a myth. But I think I also, when I work with people with archetypes, it's quite interesting. People straight away, they want to be the shaman, they want to be the mystic, they want to be the ruler. And that's the left brain ego, the desire. It's not actually the truth of who they are. And I think that if we can sit still and piece some of the puzzles that occurred in our lives, the myth will actually really begin to emerge. And then almost the sense is, and what do I do differently now in the myth? What do I do with this?
That's fascinating. And I guess what that's all pointing to is the importance of, figuring out what myth you're actually in, right back to that point. And what I did find interesting there is you talking about the ugly duckling myth, because I that resonates a little with me too, and people that I talk to. It's this idea that it's actually what you consider the ugly part of you, which is connected to your genius. The part that you were potentially ostracized for at school or wherever, which you decided to call ugly, that's the bit that's actually connected to the part of you, which is going to be your genius and how you're going to serve the world. So I can see, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to even say archetypally with that, I work a lot with people in Silicon Valley and entrepreneurs, and you can see that those that often have the visionary archetype or entrepreneurs, they can see the future before it comes. But if they can't articulate it, if they can't get the funding for it, or they don't have the tribe to support them in it, they go into the orphan child. Nobody gets me, nobody understands me, I'm all alone. Like even the little duck goes like, what is it? One little animal won't even bite me, I'm so ugly, and it's that sense of, in that we've all felt that when, and I think Jung's also got that quote, like loneliness, it's not about being alone, but it's when you can't share that innermost part of yourself with someone. And to me, I think that's the bit that it's not really about the ugly and the pretty and the ugly. It's that sense of feeling disconnected or an outsider or not met. And that's why I love groups like this. Like so often we've lost, like Carolyn Mace would say, the role of the holy witness. And I think that's so often we sometimes tell the same story over and over and over again. And, you know, in some Indigenous tribes, they say you just tell it 3 times. Between the telling of it from the 4th to the 1000th of what that bastard ex-husband did to you or your ex-colleague did or whatever, doesn't change. But so often we have to keep telling the story because we haven't found our power in it as the protagonist, or the meaning in it and what it actually did to build our character, because we know that character is destiny. And so I think so often when we're working mythically, it's like, what is this saying about my character, my beingness, and also my becomingness? Who is it in a way that these, you know, archetypal characters are asking us to become?
So for people listening, Kristina, where would you invite people to start in terms of figuring this stuff out? What myth am I in? Like, is there anything practical that we can kind of do? Is it about just listening to myths, or is it more?
That's one thing, but it's very simply being or going to say, like, maybe there were some Disney ones when you were younger that really called to you, like Beauty and the Beast or something like that. Or there's been something in a film or a media way that you've always kind of resonated with when you kind of like saw that. And I think that within that, then it's being able to say, well, why was I drawn to these types of books as a child? Because you meet kids that, you know, born in Australia, they love Norse mythology more than anyone that was born, say, in Sweden. Like, what is it about that they were like, I had to know about the Vikings and, you know, Ragnarok, or whenever like one of those like Marvel films come out, I'm the first one that's there. So I think it's like really being able to investigate, well, what are the patterns that I've kind of been relating to? But again, the thing to be able to view them archetypally is you have to be able to see them impersonally. So it's actually, and that you know, the archetypes have both a light and a kind of shadow attribute. And again, that they're universal. So it's something about like the ugly, what is the universality in that story that kind of speaks to me? Is it that I never had the homecoming that I deserved or the welcoming? So I think it's also in the emotions that we kind of feel, to be able to say, or even, you know, in Wizard of Oz, like, you've always had the red slippers. Like, is it because we never had a fairy godmother or someone like that in our life to be able to say that to us? So I think it's from what we didn't experience and what we desperately wanted to experience, as much as where was my natural inclination and desire? Where was that kind of being pulled? Because for some people it's the indigenous, or for some people it's also cross-cultural. It's like, well, how does the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters myth, how does it play out in Australia versus the rest of the world? And I think in Australia, obviously, because myth is so sacred. So when the word myth is confused with lie, I think those that love mythology were just like really, really hurts. And so how in Australia, like so often, we're not almost, we don't have the wisdom to hold the truth of what some of these indigenous for over centuries have been exposed to, as well as a lot of the myths there are location specific. So it's not, and you have to go to different parts of the land to be able to be exposed to the myth. Well, we're like, no, I want it all in one download. And I think that, like any great piece of art, myths are always revealing over time. So you can keep going back and reading it and getting more and more insight, whether it's Parsifal is something I think that I will never be done exploring for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I have a few myths like that I think are going to be with me forever too. So I can really resonate with that. A couple of things are coming up for me when I hear you say that. And one of the things is taking these patterns and these desires and these inclinations seriously. As opposed to just seeing them as whimsical or fanciful and not really kind of seeing them as really woven into your life. Because I feel like in our culture, particularly in the West, it is seen that way. There's sort of flights of fancy. Whereas, you know, I've read Jung, where he says in a healthy society, that they're built in is very, very important. And that's the way all the ancient cultures saw it. So I think maybe that first step is not only noticing where you're drawn mythically, but also taking that drawing seriously as opposed to some flight of fancy.
That's huge. And I think, again, for people that have had depression, that the left brain might say something like, go outside for a walk, look at the sun and write a gratitude list. But when you're in it, you're actually in the underworld. And so, you would be, and the way that in the mind works in the underworld, the closest you can get to language would be poetry, but it's actually myths, symbols, archetypes, image, music. And that's why actually going into a Netflix series archetypally, and that's why when you read a really good book with a really strong protagonist and really great archetypal characters, it's like you become them. So their epiphany is yours. Their transformation is yours. It's like for me, when I watched on Netflix, The Queen's Gambit. So I actually felt, wow, from that disassociation that I also had as a child to almost the reclamation of my own spirit by being able to so identify kind of with the character. And I think part of it, again, is because we, in transformation, two things are really, really critical. It's like ritual and embodiment. And so often, if we don't even have a great exposure to the humanities and kind of to the arts or to imagination, or like Rudolf Steiner, imagination, intuition, and inspiration, or romanticism also has its 5 eyes. If we only know how to look at things literally, and not as almost that the earth is alive, it's a very kind of living being, it's sentient. We would have a very different relationship. So the fact that we don't even see these stories as alive and influencing us. And I think that's that Auden quote, W.H. Auden, we're lived by powers we pretend to understand. And I think that makes people nervous, especially politicians, going into that unknown. But it's actually all created out of the void, which is what all the mythologies kind of show. So I think part of that is also our own uncomfortability with the darkness, the unknown, the fallow, which is why that Persephone myth is kind of so crucial, because it's actually in the invisible period is where all the growth happens, where the gestation happens. And again, it's not based on a culture of productivity and kind of performance, but it's a feeling life. And again, when the head and the heart are kind of disconnected, we just want really cognitive understanding. But then, like most people, like they say, it's like shelf knowledge, because the books haven't been lived, they're second experience. So many of us, I think, when we work mythically, we begin having a direct experience where it becomes much more of a cellular knowing. It's in the body, not just some cognitive understanding.
And if we stay in the head, we do tend to move towards that literalism, which is moving us so far away from myth. And I believe the pandemic of literalism has just caused so many issues. I mean, blood has been shed, and I find that quite sad, actually.
Well, to work metaphorically, like if someone comes to me, say, for an archetypal consultation, and they might get the bully archetype or the beggar, it doesn't mean you're literally sitting there on the street with a begging bowl. You could be begging for attention, begging in the sense of, say, approval on social media with likes. There's so many ways that kind of can be read. But I think because we've lost the capacity to see things metaphorically and symbolically, because metaphors connect, the intellect kind of separates. So it's so crucial to be able to have pictorial imagination as well. And that's why what some people choose to do with their children is to allow them to read the fairy and the folk tales first. So the child can then say, well, what does Cinderella look like in my own eye? And then, that not Disney's version becomes the child's version. It's like that the child can kind of go into their own imagination and say, well, what does Thor and all of his like tools kind of look like? And I think that's something that we've kind of lost. And so then sometimes why we go against myth, because we think, oh, it's not for me, because we only have what was kind of in a way the pictorial realization of it. But it's to be able to visualize that within oneself. For me, when I look at some of the paintings of Persephone, that's not how my inner world perceives her. And if I haven't known that actually my inner world is more important than my outer world, I might then discount what I see and discount some of the inherent truths that are in the myth. And I think that's what mythology does. It's like, so it's true for me at the moment, it's 11:06 a.m. and it's true for you that it's 8 something, in Sydney. Both are true, but what's the capital T truth, that universal truth? And that's why I think when we look at the myths, even like a Gilgamesh or a Nana, one of the old Sumerian ones, there's this universal truths that kind of come through that are beyond race and gender and religion, of the experience of being human.
Yeah, I love that. And that mythological ground also gives us the ability to hold both those truths at once, that it's 11:06 and 8:06. And to be able to kind of hold the tension that both those things are true simultaneously.
Well, we know that F. Scott Fitzgerald, the sign of intelligence is being able to hold 2 opposing viewpoints in the mind at the same time and not go insane. But that's now not intelligence, that's everyday life. And it's moving into that either or. And so often with a lot of the mythology, it's like it's either the upper world or the underworld, but it's both the upper and the underworld, so that both and. And I think also with indigenous cosmology, it's not dream time, because that's almost like past, present, future, dream time. It's actually dreaming, because it's present continuous. The world is always being dreamed into form. And so what we do, especially in Australia, is we discount it into saying, oh, that's some ancient folklore about why that mountain is like that and why that river is like that. But actually, in the dreaming, it's always being birthed. And I think that's what I feel is missing a lot from myth, because we want to characterize it as something either in the past or historical, instead of it's so alive now. And when you develop that archetypal eye and that mythic consciousness and the symbolic awareness, you can't but read everything as a myth.
Yeah, I love that. And it prevents us from being pulled to the left or to the right into one truth or another, the mythic ground. I think there's that lovely line around don't mistake mythology for ideology, and don't mistake symbols for superstition. And so there's this idea that without myth, we kind of get pulled into the right or pulled into the left. And then, of course, once we're in there, it's an echo chamber and we just get validation. But we're not in the middle anymore. We've become rigid and fixed with our views. And from there, we can't grow, From there, we can't grow because we're certain about what it is we think we know.
Absolutely. And even just small things. It's like, I sometimes think at the end of the day, oh, hooray, I've cleared my email box. Wake up in the morning and I'm like, this is Sisyphus. Okay, right, what do we do? So it's like, how do you find the pleasure in the daily grind? Because that boulder is just kind of keep going to rock back on you. Or you look at the sirens, and to me, that's like clickbait. Like all of a sudden I'm looking like Beverly Hills 90210, where are they now? And like, I've lost 2 hours down the internet rabbit hole. It's like, that was the sirens. Like, you can start seeing them. And of course, obviously with all the attention now on narcissism, it's that, that with narcissists, being able to, like, he almost like from being so intoxicated with his own image. And I think, with all these selfies and everything that we kind of see, so it's like, it is all around us now. And narcissisms they're very obviously linked with even, the black hole, which is, they don't believe they have enough light in them. They have to steal it from everybody else, So the fact that these, myths, or even you might have some boomer generation, very phaeton-like to the young kids who think that they can take the chariot and do everything without actually learning, actually it's important to learn how the photocopying machine works and some of these basics of business. So they're lived. And I think part of it is because Yes, yeah. Well, how do we do that? Do we like go to Wikipedia and look at what are the myths and start reading some of them? But I think actually a really good start, if we wanted something super duper practical, was Stephen Fry's book Mythos. Is absolutely out of this world in the sense, and you just sometimes sit there and go, I didn't have that as a child. But as reading it as an adult, I felt that child in me come alive to how I could interpret the world through these mythic stories. So, and obviously he's written follow-up ones from there. But if you wanted something practical, that's a really great first step.
I'd agree. And I'm thinking about that full inbox that fills up every single day. And Camus' quote of, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. And this idea about, finding joy in that repetitiveness. It's quite interesting. Now, but one thing you said around narcissism and narcissists, I remember when we were speaking prior, you talked about this kind of, would I call it a problem, perhaps, about this over-identification with the archetype that I think we're seeing a lot now too. And I wonder if that's somehow connected to narcissism, but I'm interested if you could speak to that generally.
Yeah, I think that there's... So what happened personally in my experience, I'll just speak from my experience, was I went and saw a healer and was in almost like a little bit of a trance state. And they were saying, I'm seeing this young girl, somehow these 4 horses and a chariot come out of the ground, and the person there like kidnaps her and takes her underground. And I'm like, oh, what does all of that mean? But I knew enough about my intuition and synchronicity to do something about it. So when I Googled it, it was the myth almost coming out of me that I was in, and it was really the precursor to almost like a dark night of the soul. And I think that sometimes we throw that around, from that term from St. John of the Cross, like, oh, it's a dark night of the soul. But many dark nights of the soul, they usually go for between 6 to 9 years. And so it was really a 9-year process that began with that vision of that myth. But there was a time where then I did feel like I was Persephone. And within that, then I almost in a way didn't have any agency. I had conflated, or I had become the myth, it felt like. And that was that very, very fine line, like, am I the myth, or is the myth living me? And what do I do with this? Because it just became this over-identification with the I amness of I am Persephone. And there was something that, and it took a lot of, in a way, depth psychological work to be able to extricate myself from that. And then also to be able to recognize that, that was missing an important part of the myth, which was actually when she was kidnapped, hijacked, she was Kore, Kore, which means maiden. She only actually became Persephone after she married Hades, when she married Death. And so for all the time that I was in the underworld, I thought it was Persephone, I was still Kore. And I think that that's what a lot of myths show, is like, what's that fate to destiny change that happens? So one story is the fate of being kidnapped, but the destiny is that I will now become queen of the underworld and healer to guide all these other kind of souls. And then she becomes like a Nana, who actually puts her ear to the ground and consciously descends. So it's an unconscious descent versus a conscious descent. And I think there's certain things like that which then influence the myth. But you can find that, yes, of course, in goddess circles where I am Athena, I am Aphrodite, I am, but then very simply, we can sometimes see a male colleague and just go, wow, Dionysus is really having his way with him, or or like, wow, that Zeus patriarchal, it's like so strong in him. So it's that fine line where it's almost like that, do I become more a channel and an intermediary for the mythic world and what wants to kind of be in the physical, rather than the I amness of it.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you, what would be the red flags, crossing over the line into that over-identification? And I'm hearing quite clearly that it's around those I am statements, isn't it? When it sort of completely encompasses your being. It's an interesting one. Jung talks about anima possession quite a lot, which I think is obviously quite similar.
Yeah, and almost the sense that, or like anyone in any kind of shadow work, the minute that you point out this shadow, like, whoa, it's just going to kind of come back at you. And I think that, again, when we're in an anima or animus possession, it takes a lot of work to actually even recognize that, oh, I've been hijacked by that part of the psyche. Do you know? And so when we're in it, sometimes we're just in it. And that, I think, is, again, the sense of, can I surrender to the process and the gratitude of it, while, again, I think that's why, you know, the Persephone myth speaks so strongly to me, is because it can't always be spring. We can't always live on the surface of life, always in the summer. And our culture, you know, all the, in this time I'll use myths like lie, infinite growth on a finite planet. That narrative doesn't work anymore. Constant upward trajectory of growth, out the window. So like you were saying earlier, all macro narratives are currently in crisis. A job for life, that there's only two genders, you know, marriage forever, all these things are being kind of disintegrated, only physical currency. And we're in a story gap. And I think that when we know that when we're in the story gap, it's a little bit easier, because we're in that liminal period, which is not yet left one and not yet kind of entered kind of the other. And within that liminality, like traditionally, like say in Australia, you know, the young boy being taken out to the desert, but then when he returns after the 3 days of initiation rites, he's a man. We haven't actually returned from whatever that desert is, whether it was what happened to us in COVID or what's kind of still coming with the recession or environmental crisis. And so in that liminal, we have to find a new certainty that actually can't be found in the external world. So that certainty really can only come from my breath, my, in a way, my perspective. It can't actually be found in shifting sands. And so that's why I think there's more and more of the pull to the universal and timeless truth, because really, again, we were talking about time, but actually when we're in the eternalness of something, it's a really different relationship we have with the world.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I loved what you said there about being in a gap between stories. I think it was Joanna Macy who said we're hospicing one culture while we're simultaneously midwifing another.
Absolutely. And both are occurring simultaneously. So things are like the destruction and creation is simultaneous. So destruction is the right hand of creation. You can't have one without the other. But there's a difference between unconscious destruction and conscious destruction. And in that, by putting something in a hospice, we say it had value. It's how you end something, is how you begin everything. So if we begin everything with this hostility against the patriarchy, the banking system, this and this, we're just going to bring it into the new system instead of it served its time. And now it's time to birth something new. And I think that, you know, like in indigenous cultures, they say sometimes the time of the child's gestation period is from when it was just an idea in either the father or the mother's mind, right? We've got the 9 months visible gestation. I feel that why it's so important to work mythically at the moment, because there's so many of these ideas that are gestating in the collective unconscious, requiring us to have an archetypal or a mythic narrative to weave into something new. And I think, again, that's why I really love so much that part about Penelope in the Odyssey, in that in the unraveling, she was actually creating a future. And so how do we unlearn and unknow and unravel so many of these stories that in a way don't hold true to almost like the higher kind of, in a way, the Platonic values, like beauty with a capital B, you know, justice with a capital J, like, you know, those kind of values.
Yeah, I even in this conversation, I kind of feel my shoulders dropping a little bit, in the sense that everything's okay. You know, it's like I feel, you know, I see there's a lot of angst and anxiety out there, but I feel like when you start to find your mythic ground, your mythic territory, and you're able to move your mind in this way, it sort of somehow eases the burden of life somehow. Does that make sense?
It's like it becomes a larger cradle in which you can lie in, right? So it's your days of your lives drama of your individual personal life within this larger narrative of what's kind of occurring. And there's you know, people that have said like myth is actually a psychological cradle for the lived experience. So yeah, it's a perfect place to turn.
Wow, I love that. I'm just wondering if this maybe is a good opportunity to open it up to everybody and see if there's any questions for you. Do you feel like it's an appropriate time?
Absolutely, yeah.
Great. All right. Well, in that case, I think I'll just bring us all together and open it up. If anybody wants to ask Kristina a question, you can use your raise hand button and we'll call you in. Silence is also beautiful. I've got some other questions myself, but I'll keep it open. There we go. Sally Ann's got a question. Do you want to bring yourself off mute and feel free to ask Kristina?
Thank you so much, Kristina. It's been like, I need to go back and I've perhaps got 9 years of work here to go back and enjoy and listen. And, you know, I'm thinking, oh, yes, I need to look at that and this. So I have I mean, I should tell you, I've got everything's literal. So I really struggle with it when we did the soul. I want to go out and I find things. So when I'm going through the canal, I'll perhaps find this picture in the canal. I'll find stones. That's what I do when I'm going out with the myth. But it's like if I don't find that, I really struggle. So I know words are like spells for me. And I'm very new to this, and I'm very angry inside because I don't have the words like you do, which is really painful because the thoughts and the wanting to support people or, you know, support myself and do things is there. But so how do I I don't even know what I want to do. How do I understand it's perhaps like you said, I'm not depressed, but it's more of the, I don't know, why can't I go out? And I know there's a purpose and I know there's hundreds of years, but what can I do now to really enjoy the myths rather than having to find something solid to bring home? Sorry if that doesn't make sense, but
it just made me think, like Campbell said, like, you know, people are always like, what's the purpose of myth and things like that? It's more to feel fully alive. And I think that sometimes we do ourselves a disservice by trying to understand the myth rather than having the experience of a myth. So even like that image that you kind of showed me, there was like, I just went to some of the Sumerian myths or the Egyptian, where it's almost like I let then the visual part of me speak to me. But I don't think it's about actually doing something. I think it's more being able to want to within yourself, or like, you know, it's how do we make the invitation to other people's genius so it kind of comes out, but it's also how do we make that same invitation to ourselves? And so often it's best done by leaving ourselves alone. And there is almost just something, if there's an element of a myth that, or why you're interested in mythology, it might be that you're looking for life purpose. It might be that it's about meaning. It might be, I mean, because within all the myths, we have all the human experiences. The gods aren't better than us that they're not betrayed, you know, or let down or destroyed. Do you know, it's like the frailty of human life is within them. So if there's an experience that you've had that's really shaken you to the core, it's them being able to find like, it even happens to the gods. So it becomes almost this form of solace. But I don't think also, like you said, it's not about the words either. So it could be actually listening to some classical music of Swan Lake or something like that, where another part of your brain can engage. And if all else fails, just look at the Netflix in the sense that what is coming back up now? Why are all the King Arthur stories up? You know, what is it about that? And get really, really curious about, okay, is this more about the Arthurian table? Is this more about the knights actually? Or is this like, in a lot of what's occurring now is like Circe got released. So it's like the rewrite of her as like this mad sorceress, or going to an art gallery. And I love all the images of Circe. So there's different ways. I mean, is that helping or not? But I don't think it's actually about how do I solve it? I don't think it's that. It's I'm inviting myself to have a relationship with some of these mythic characters. And yes, sometimes if we didn't get that in our education or our early childhood home, we might have to kind of, you know, do some Wikipedia searches about some of these fables and some of these myths. But other than that, it's more just being able to say, how can I find a meaning beyond this? Meaning in this beyond what my 5 physical senses are telling me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Joel, brother, feel free.
Thank you. And it's actually appropriate for me to be not on mute now. Hi, Kristina. Hey, everyone. This is kind of, it's not particularly well formed into a question. It's more just a broader kind of curiosity. I'm really curious about kind of bridging between myths. So kind of that bridge between a myth that you're currently living and a myth that you are kind of drawn towards experiencing or aspire to. And also kind of that experience of the myth you're living in an interpersonal sense. So, you know, if kind of one person's on a hero's journey, but another's on an odyssey. Yeah, just curious about those things, curious about, you know, what light you might have to shine on that.
Yeah, well, interestingly, at the Joseph Campbell Foundation this year, all our articles were focused, or the themes were about decentralizing the hero. And now, and this is now Kristina speaking, I'm not speaking on behalf of the association, this is me. I think that actually we're moving beyond the hero's journey, and it's not even about the heroine's journey. Because I think now people are saying, okay, well, there was solar and masculine and linear and action orientated, so let's make it like lunar and feminine, collective and process. I don't think it's that at all. I think it's like, what's the role of the trickster? I think that actually what the hero does is it gets us into that binary, again, that either or, and we can see that with what the West did with Zelensky by making him a hero. The Ukrainian people good, the Russian people bad, and what those binary narratives do is the polarization. And that's what my article for Joseph Campbell this week was about, which was on about the purposefulness of dualities, to be able to get to the third alchemical element. But within that, there's also other things to recognize, which is some people don't complete the hero's journey. Some people die from addiction. They stay stuck in the belly of the whale. They die with a needle in their arm. So there's this reality of it that we don't want to paint it also in the sense like, oh yeah, and we're all on our hero's journey and this and things like that. But there is that element, if you do have, I guess, the taxonomy vernacular to be able to say, you know, I'm in the refusal of the call, right? That's one experience. That would be very different to the dog recognizing Odysseus when he returns home, right? So two very different kind of experiences that are occurring there. But part of it, I think, is even though the hero's journey, it's meant to be nonlinear, it's taken as steps. I have to do this, and then I have to atone, and then and it's like we don't learn that way, which is why, you know, my first book I wrote as fiction, it's about seasonal, tidal, lunar, and circadian rhythms. But it's again, we've got to be able to, we learn through allegory and parables. It's why, you know, all the great spiritual texts are almost parables. So I think it's like, how do we use the parables to be able to explain kind of where we are, rather than judge and kind of compare, but also be able to say, what is it about a person that might need the model of the hero's journey and can't maybe be a bit more loose in the Iliad or the Odyssey, or has to make their own kind of meaning from it. So again, like all things, I think it's that curiosity. Does that answer it, or was there something more specific that I can speak to?
I mean, I sort of just raised hero's journey as an example off the top of my head. Yeah, I really like that point of kind of extracting the really relevant parables and attaching to those. And I really liked that point about I guess kind of the comparative things and looking for, you know, where it was, you know, Odysseus's dog on one side and the refusal of the call on another, and kind of looking for those sort of magnetic points between two people's stories. Yeah, and just how they might
trapped in the belly of the whale and one that got out, like, and what are those two experiences?
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Oh, I enjoyed that little piece. Thank you both, Joel and Kristina. And just to say that, you know, at the Fifth Direction, we're kind of all about, you know, moving beyond the hero. So I would totally agree with what you're saying there, Kristina. Is we need a new what's next, you know? And it's
sorry, can I just
female version. Joel, go on. Yeah.
Can I just jump? Yeah. That was the other thing I was going to say. That whole thing around, it not being the hero, it not being the heroine. I kind of like the idea that it's about the world that they exist in, and like and there's a circularity to that. Like to put it into super dorky terms, like every Luke Skywalker needs to become an Obi-Wan Kenobi for someone else at some point.
Yeah. And I think also within that, it's the it also allows us to sometimes lost with how to give a friend advice or something like that. But it's like when you can actually say, oh, remember when Neo, like he wouldn't pick up the phone and Orpheus was this, or all those things. And when we had like all of that sudden, it's like this entry point. And that's why mythology is so important to be able to work with, say, some of the personal issues that we're struggling with, because it's not happening to you, but you've had that experience. And so there's that depersonalization, so it's not so serious. And I really recommend the work of Kwame Scruggs, who runs Alchemy, which is takes myth to inner city children, to boys, through telling myth and drumming circles. And these kids are now graduating. They're like out of gangs and this because they could share their feeling, where it's not like, oh, I'm this, and like no boy in a gang is going to kind of turn up like that. But when like that Kwame is drumming the beat and says the story and just says, and why do you think the king did that? And what was the role of the tiger here? All of a sudden, these kids are just like, actually, I can find the trailer and I'll pop it in here. They made a film about it because it's so powerful. And I would love to see more, like we've got here, obviously you this group here with the fifth direction, but more of those mythic circles where it's not like, we're not into that I amness, but I've had that experience. And that's like, we've all had experiences of being victimized, but if I make the victim my identity, it's the lens through which I view the world, right? So again, myth gives us the capacity to say, I've had that experience. And almost in that disidentification, there's some space for where a new insight or some consciousness or awareness can lead to a different choice.
That's fabulous. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. Is it Eagle? But you're up.
Hey, great to hear your insights, Kristina.
We presented at a conference last week in Kaunas, so in Lithuania. So that's why it's
feels like a very interesting continuation of the conversation. So I actually wanted to piggyback on the question that Joel has raised and sort of just take it to a different level. So when you're talking about naming certain myths and experiences that you're having, what do you, what's the utility? Like, do you see any utility in maybe naming your, well, shall we say, shadows, inner demons, whatever parts you don't like? Because whenever we are trying to, integrate the light and dark inside ourselves, or let's say in situations that we might be in, maybe sometimes those parts happen to be walking outside. But say if someone has, I don't know, depression or eating disorder, or whatever problems they're having, do you think, would you find it helpful to try and say, okay, like, is this depression like a Persephone, or is it more like Hades? Or like, do you find that level helpful, or is it like taking it a little too far? What's your take on it?
No, I think that's really helpful. And it's the role of, say, like, if anyone does constellation work, family constellations, the ability to be a representative, but it's also to be able to stand in that shoes and to be able to say, say Demeter, like many women relate to that in many senses. Maybe their daughter married someone that was not very kind of good to them. So it's like, it's not that the daughter's lost, but she's lost to the mother. So it's almost like being able to stand in, if you yourself have loss, maybe your dog died or you lost a job, can I actually stand in the position of Demeter, of what that feels like? I've lost my daughter. I don't know where she is. I kind of can't find her. My realm is the horizontal. She's gone to the vertical. So to be able to experience in that way, I think it's incredibly helpful. But then again, almost like to be able to come out of it as well is then the next part of it. And what I did at the Australasian Constellation Conference is we actually worked the myth. So people represented Hades. They represented the underworld. They represented the role, really, which Hermes and Mercury played, which was a psychopomp, a person that can go between two worlds. So what's that experience of being a psychopomp? So you can kind of stand in that kind of role. You could be Helios, the sun, which is kind of the awareness. You could be the pomegranate. So it's again being able to become that thing, to be able to get the insight of it. So I think it is incredibly helpful to be able to do that, but again, not to be over identified with it. And I think that, like in Lithuania, we have, Agle, your name, and the serpent. So it's like, what would it be like to be the serpent? And to be able to say, what was the feeling of that? And I think that's where I can also put a link in there. I wrote a piece about mythic imagination. And so in that, to be able to feel one's feelings, but also to, in a way, the becoming and the embodiment, to feel them at a deeper level, that I don't then have to reiterate them. A bit like I said earlier, like telling the story over and over because you haven't got to the meaning of it. It's can I actually feel the depth of the feeling. So then the feeling is no longer feeling me, but I'm the one that has this conscious engagement with that feeling of whether it could be something like distress or, heartbreak or something like that, as much as awe and wonder and things like that. Does that help?
I think it's getting there. I think I just want to pull you. I want to keep pulling because it's such an interesting direction. So if I'm reading you, what you're saying is that okay, try to feel yourself as well. Let's say Hades or the snake or Adonis or what have you, right? And then look at what feelings does Hades or Adonis has. But what if we do it differently from the other way around, right? Like, what is my anger? Like, what if I start with a feeling? Like, what is my anger like? Is there a narcissist inside me? Is there an Athena and a Demeter in there? Like, does my joy feel like this or like that? Like, what do you make of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And even just that sense of how we can even work with archetypes, which is like, I can be standing in the line at the supermarket and getting like really, really pissed off how long the line is. And then I'm like, okay, can I call in another archetype here to meet it and call in the Dalai Lama? And then all of a sudden I'm just like, I'm not counting, it says 7 items and I'm counting everyone's like in the basket. Like, are you really kind of 7? That's all kind of gone. I've been able to go to a different archetypal power. And I think that that's what we've forgotten, in that we have all these range of archetypes to play with, but we often only have a narrow, limited one, either the unconscious story that's playing us or just the few roles that we continuously kind of like. So it's that sense to be able to say, like, when you have a problem, sometimes the best thing to say is to say, well, how would a shaman perceive it? Or how would the mystic kind of perceive it? Or how would the trickster kind of perceive it? So we're getting out of its the small self to be able to go to the large self that can pull on a lot of these different identities. So I think it's to be able to say, there's so much examples, say, of rage that we've kind of seen in the myths. So it's like, can I actually pull on another rage so I can almost recalibrate or reorganize my own little S kind of rage? So I think that's really kind of helpful, where I know myself sometimes before I have to speak, while I feel more identified, as I said earlier, with Persephone, sometimes when I have to speak at a conference, I really pull on the power of Athena to be able to say, Athena, can you stand behind me and feed me words and give me that power that I don't naturally feel I would have in Persephone's kind of position, which is very kind of dominant. So I think it's much more being able to kind of say, well, like, how would a child kind of view this? Or how would the queen? And within that, there's just so much more range of movement. And I think that's why we often feel stuck in our lives, or stuck in, especially in our emotional lives, because we just have a limited repertoire of characters and feelings that we're working with, while, you know, there's a whole, you know, scale and orchestra and color of life. And let's open ourselves up to the experiencing of these feelings and emotions. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm thinking of when you're speaking like that about shamanic levels of perception as well, this idea that, you know, one problem can be solved from the level of perception above it, you know. So yeah, they would say if I'm having an issue at hummingbird level, to raise my consciousness to eagle and look at it through that perspective, etc., which I think is lovely and archetypal actually in nature.
Yes. Yeah.
Am
I looking at like scorpion? Am I looking at from the snake level, or am I looking at it from the eagle level?
100%,
you know,
exactly.
Yeah.
And yeah, in a way, you know, they were tapping into the archetypes then, you know, before Jung had formed the concept, I guess. So they've been around for a long time. Al.
Hi, Kristina. Thank you for this. There's so much to unpack. So I wrote, what myth am I in? And I had to say I'm in a few different ones. And I find I'm really drawn to the hero or the knight. So growing up, I felt teased about my name, and then I read what it meant, and it meant defender of men. And so then I think I overstepped into that, like standing up to the bullies, standing up for what's right, because that's what I'm supposed to do. And then that explained a lot of the dreams that I'd have about wanting to fight and stand up for things, but feeling powerless and being in slow motion, or trying to open doors and they didn't lead anywhere, things like that. So, and I really like how you're talking about when you need to step into other things, but I mean, that's just having a great awareness on all the things that you can call on. But the other thing I really loved is the question, where do I find certainty? And this was especially during the lockdowns, and I've written sunrises, sunsets, water and breath. And whenever I'm around that, I feel peace, and then you feel that you can stay still with everything else that's going on. But I just wanted to say thank you. There's a lot coming up for me and a lot to explore, and far more than I can articulate at the moment.
Yeah, but actually, just to add on that last one, if you know the myth of Ariadne and Theseus, where Theseus slays the Minotaur and runs off to the island with Ariadne, and she's like, finally, I get the guy, you know, I'm on the island, everything's great, and then he leaves her. And actually, it was actually then being abandoned that she then has the relationship with the Dionysus, which is by all accounts probably one of the happiest that kind of actually existed in the gods. But that myth is so crucial when the physical world betrays you. It's only often when the physical world betrays you do we look to the mythic realm. So she couldn't have gone straight to the god Dionysus. She actually had to have her whole life fall apart, whether for some people it's an illness or something that you thought you could rely on and it got taken away from you. It's all of those, you know, rug being pulled out from under you moments, and then allows you to do that. And one of the things that, you know, people say if you've been through a rug pulling event is the importance of being able to watch the sunrise and the sunset, because it never not happens. The sun never doesn't rise. And so we start building our trust back in nature again, and then to be able to start trusting other people. And I was just then thinking of, because the Joseph Campbell Foundation worked on the new film, The Green Knight, which you might about
I've
a different nights. And I think the other thing is that what I always think about the knight archetype, which is under what banner are you riding out under? So often it's like, you know, am I riding out under love, or am I riding out under power, or riding out under wisdom, you know? But to be able to almost in a way be a carrier kind of for a larger message. But again, yes, finding like in the quarantine, because what happens when our space is restricted, our sense of time is also kind of distorted as well. And again, to be able to find certainty within oneself, it's something that we can't find externally. And I think all the myths will always say, look within, look within, look within. But so often, until we actually recognize that, I don't know if anyone was like me when the pandemic first started, like trying to read all the articles, all the research, myself trying to individually make sense of something in this like real panicked kind of state, to kind of be able to say, okay, there's a different knowing now that I'm going to have to kind of rely on what my next step is, or what I do. And I think that, again, like you said, the breath and the water and the sunset, sunrise, certain certainties. And that's why we study patterns. Like when I was a futurist, it wasn't that I was a brilliant futurist, but I could read patterns well, because the pattern predicts the future. So if you've got the pattern of addiction, the addict's always going to put the substance above everything else. Of course, they'll lose their family, their job, their health. The pattern tells us that, do you know? And so that's why when we look at, say, the seasons, it's like we always know that spring comes before summer, but this spring was very, very different to last spring. So you're in that dance between the changing and the changeless. And I think within that can actually, in that dance, we can actually find some certainty, and being able to hold paradoxical thoughts, which is really what mysticism really is about. But again, to be able to find the mystical kind of truth that exists in these experiences does give us a level of certainty, and, as you know, keep coming back to, it's a psychological cradle that we can really rest into.
That really resonated, because orphan child comes up for me quite a bit when the rug's been pulled, but now I can recognize it. But I think in the past I've reached, like, I don't want to feel that anymore. And you said something earlier about, can we let it run its course? And I think I'm starting to learn I need to understand why it's coming up and let it run its course.
But also, why are the orphan children's always the star of all the myths and the folktales, like, right? Because it's almost like you have to be outside of society to see how sick it is. It's like the sense, and that's why it's so important when we do work, whether it's systemic racism, that everything is systemic, because almost like you can't treat someone for alcohol without saying what was the conditions in the family that led to that, or the society. So if we're like this, a goldfish in a bowl, but the water's toxic, why do we keep saying something's wrong with me, instead of actually we're in a toxic society at the moment? And I think also within that orphan child, it's like, so because the number one human need is for belonging. So that like we sacrifice so much of our authenticity to belong. And then when we're not willing to do that, and we feel orphaned and exiled and not included and everything like that, well, traditionally without the internet and all these things previously, yes, but now I actually feel all those rebels and all those outsiders and all those orphans, we're all actually coming together, because we do actually have the medicine, but it's by being almost in a way extricated from society that we have it. And so long as we don't go with that young child, which that orphan child, which is, see what you did to me, why do instead of actually saying, and that's where I think we find that mythic truth. There was no way I could have found this medicine had I not been orphaned. Thank you. And I think that's that gratitude that we start getting from the myths, which is, okay, that's why this disillusionment had to happen here, this letdown, this rug pulling, this, because there's no way I could have become the character that was required for what the next step of the journey or my destiny was or is.
Thank you for that. That just connected into what Asher said earlier about being really close to your genius. So that just connected for me. Thanks.
And also Michael Mead's work is amazing, and he's written a book on the genius, and like I said, your genius only comes out in service to others. It's not in self-actualization, it's in service to others.
Well, that seems like a wonderful place to take a pause, but I will also put it out there, if anyone doesn't feel complete, or there's a question in your jaw, we're happy to kind of take, as long as you don't mind, Kristina, we're happy to take another one before we close down for the evening. Is there anyone out there with a burning question? Seems like we're all done. We're all done. Well, Kristina, it's just left for me to say thank you so much. That was a truly enriching conversation. There was so much gold in there for me to think about, and from the questions, everybody else seemed to take an awful lot out of that too. So I just want to thank you for taking your time all the way from Lithuania. And Kristina will be on our shores in the next month or so. So maybe as a way of sort of closing out, do you want to kind of let us know about your physical whereabouts for the rest of the year and what your plans are?
Yeah. Well, first it'll be to leave here, which is proving more challenging than I thought. I feel that there's a new story actually happening in these Baltic states, rather than these three little countries that, you know, in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that were fought over between the German and the Russian forces. So there's something interesting here kind of brewing, which I'm sure I'll stay in touch with. But also looking forward to going back to Adelaide, where my mother is. I was in Sydney before I left. It was only supposed to be no more than 6 months, and it's been 3 years. So I do feel a bit like I'll be like Odysseus myself returning. I don't know how I will be, you know, recognized or in a way received. But I think that there's a bit like, you know, what Alistair was saying. It's like, why this pattern, or why this? I only see the hardships of it. I only see how hard it's been, or the pain of it, you know, and, you know, why am I always Cinderella scrubbing the floors? Why don't I ever get to go to the ball? Or why are my ideas seen as too radical and not included? And I think that when we can kind of sense into the destiny of it, which I think is what the myths and the archetypes kind of give us, it's almost like we then become this channel and the instrument for the next little part of the myth to co-weave. And I think the weaver is a really strong archetype, like at the moment, like weaving these new conversations kind of together for what's required. And I think then it's like you wouldn't wish it to be of any other different, any way different. But I think that can only come from that level of that there was a co-creation occurring. So in the sense of, you know, it's not the doer and the done to, that it was all kind of being done to me, that I also have some agency in particular myths or life experiences that have happened. And I think within that, then we have much more an open heart or a compassion and ability to open ourselves up, that we're more able to be with what emerges. We're not in the forcing, we're not in the controlling, we're much more kind of in the flow of life. And then within that, I think that's when the genius and the service starts to come. But as I said, no fixed speaking or projects yet, but I look forward to be able to do that. And yeah, people can watch the TED Talk if they're interested in being able to more see how myths, in a way, they unite us, they don't divide us. And with so much division in the world at the moment, like we were saying earlier with Asher, it's like the midterm elections. Anything that kind of leads us much more to this unifying wholeness and this ability to respect all cultures, all people, but also to be able to connect us and say that there's myths of the stars and there's myths of the land as well. And I think sometimes we forget that there's some of these star myths that could really help us. And for some of us, we need more grounding. So some of these earth myths, but what a beautiful world we live in. And thank you for the opportunity to be with you my morning, your evening. And I hope I can meet some of you in person sometime.
Yeah, well, thanks, Kristina. You're so welcome to come and join us anytime. Maybe we'll see you in person when you're back here. And talking about those star myths, we should all, if we can, get outside, because there's a lunar eclipse on the way in the next, which is reaching its fullness in about an hour or so. So it's the last one for 3 years. So it seems like an appropriate moment to take advantage and witness it. So I guess it's just left to come off mute and say our goodbyes and thank Kristina if you're willing to do that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And like my email is just first name surname.com. So Kristina@KristinaDryža.com. So if there's any questions, or sometimes, you know, like afterwards, like you wake up in the morning, I should have said, if only I asked, like, please get in touch. Happy to get back to you on any questions that this brings up in the dream world.
Yeah, and I'll put all those details in the notes alongside this recording as well, so you can contact Kristina if you need to. So thanks again, Kristina. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Kristina.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristina.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
Not everyone.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.